Just to vindicate what Dr. Kenkar said before, I am a member of the Lebanese diaspora. That's a disclaimer. And maybe just one of two of Lebanese origin who have been doing work on Algeria. Before I start my formal presentation, I'd like to give some kind of background how I got to do this. As my two colleagues here know, or actually all of them, I've been doing some work on the Oman intelligentsia in Zanzibar. And in my earlier works, I have mapped the connections and ties of the Omani elite in Zanzibar to Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Istanbul, and Oman. And then once I moved into the early 20th century, issues around religious reform and nationalism, and worked on the context in which Zanzibari nationalism emerged, I found that the whole discussion of nationalism was tied to the broader discussions, and that Zanzibari nationalism formulated by Omanis had a very Arab context, and it was very much rooted in Arab nationalism. And this led me to look at other formulations of nationalism and the way religious reformers created their own versions of Arab nationalism. And because of the strong connections between Algeria and Zanzibar, I ended up looking at Algerians in Tunisia. And when I saw the call for papers for this conference, I thought that would be the good moment for me to actually make something out of the material I've been accumulating by Algerians in Tunisia. So basically what I'm going to do here is revisit a little bit the origins of Algerian nationalism based on the material I've come across. Now, the narrative of the birth and development of Algerian nationalism posits that Algerian nationalism came to Algeria from France. It was among the Algerian proletariat in French cities and within the ranks of, more specifically, l'Étoile Nord-Africaine, I'll be referring to it as ENA, that Algerian nationalism was first born, personified by Messali el-Hajj's return to Algeria in 1936, demanding Algerian independence, this time not from France, but while standing on Algerian soil. This organic relationship between Algerian nationalism and the Algerian diaspora was largely due to the highly controlled political space in Algeria, where political activism was stifled and punished by the French authorities. The Algerian diaspora found a wider margin of freedom of action and expression in France, but it also encountered new political and ideological idioms, modes of organization, and vibrant environments that inspired higher levels of political and intellectual engagement. The Algerian nationalism formulated by the ENA underscored Arab Islamic roots for Algeria and demanded independence from France. It's this demand for independence that has provided the ENA with this privileged link to the origins of Algerian nationalism. But nationalist movements are not defined by that aspect alone. At the heart of any nationalist project is a process of imagining and defining the nation. Calls for independence are only part of anti-colonial nationalism. Thus, when discussing the history of Algerian nationalism, it's imperative that we take all this into consideration and not reduce nationalism to one particular aspect. My argument here is twofold. First, Algerian nationalist thought was not shared by the Algeria-France axis alone and was not determined by Algerian connections to France and its leftist movements alone. An equally significant connection was to the Arab world, especially to Tunisia, a connection shared by the activities of the Algerian diaspora there, mainly after the First World War. Second, the point of departure to trace the process of formulating Algerian nationalism should not be the call for independence, but the moment Algeria started to be imagined as a nation and its history recreated and repackaged in order to give form and shape to that nation. That process might or might not have included clear demands for independence, but it was nevertheless the foundation of the nationalist project. While defining the modern Algerian nation has entailed dealing with different binaries such as Arab Berber, Muslim Jewish, indigenous Colon, I want to bring into attention the Ibadi Maliki one that was also essential to the formulation of Algerian nationalism. Now, I'm not the first to highlight the Algerian-Tunisian connection. James McDougall has drawn attention to that in his work on Ahmed Tawfiq al-Madani. But McDougall agreed with other scholars that the Algerian Tunisian exiles founded no movement, evaluated, quote, the influence in Algeria of the exiles' activities as weak and without echo. The evaluation of their efficacy, if by this is meant influencing movements of dissent and insurrection in North Africa, seems to be negative, unquote. I argue that the activities were neither weak nor without echo. The Algerian diaspora in Tunisia had equally important formulations of Algerian nationalism, whose version was not different from that of the ENA, and did form and did belong to an anti-colonial movement that, much like the ENA in its first stage, envisioned the struggle for Algerian independence, or for Algeria generally speaking, as part of a larger one that should liberate the whole Maghreb and the whole Arab world. If the founding of the ENA epitomizes the birth of Algerian nationalism in France, the activities of the Algerian diaspora with Tunisia's Free Constitutional Party do not count for less and should be understood in the context of the anti-colonial movement emerging in Tunisia at the time and in which Algerians participated. In fact, the heavy involvement of members of the Algerian diaspora with the Free Constitutional Party in Tunisia that ranged from raising funds to the party to administrating its daily activities to attending its events and campaigning for its mission was a clear embodiment of the nationalist thought emerging at the time in both Algeria and Tunisia, shaping the nationalist characters of each of the two nations, but linking the identity and the struggle of one to the other. This, of course, also relates to the nature and type of connections each diaspora had with its host country. The founding of the ENA was born out of the experience of Algerian workers and other North African immigrants in France, radicalized by the stark contrast between metropole and colony, as well as by their own conditions as racialized workers in France, and sponsored by the French Communist Party in its attempt to undermine colonialism and imperialism. The ENA came into being, marking North Africans and Algerians more specifically as a distinctive group in the French political landscape. The Algerian nationalism and the anti-colonial activities of the ENA challenged and contrasted with the French milieu where it emerged. But the anti-colonial activities of the Algerian diaspora, the anti-French colonial activities of the Algerian diaspora belong to a different context in terms of the diaspora's relationship to Tunisia and to Tunisian politics. While Algerians could not form their own political party in Tunisia as the ENA did in France, they did not need to, as they found refuge in the Free Constitutional Party in Tunisia. This party marked a step forward in the radicalization of Tunisian politics, an experience that the Algerian diaspora shared with the anti-colonial, So this party marked a step forward in the radicalization of Tunisian politics, an experience that the Algerian diaspora shared with the Tunisians. Algerians considered the Free Constitutional Party as their own, reflecting the way they envisioned the anti-colonial struggle as a collective one. In France, Algerians had to carve and defend their own space in the metropole. But in Tunisia, they could share the space because of the deep historical connections between the Algerian and Tunisian communities and the collective struggle against French colonialism. The Algerians' connections to and their activities in Tunisia were an echo of the multi-layered nationalism that tied the territorial nationalism, whether it was Tunisian or Algerian, to the transnational reality, in the case of the Algerians, tying Algeria to the Maghreb and to the Arab world. Now, to better illustrate my points, I focus here in particular on the role of Algerians from the Mzab Valley as members of the Algerian diaspora in Tunisia. The role in Tunisian politics and the impact of the Tunisian experience on their own politics vis-à-vis Algeria, in addition to their peculiar identity as Berbers and Ibadis, serve to challenge the framework through which Algerian nationalism has come to be understood and interpreted. Ibadis are the only surviving Kharijite group, and what distinguished the Ibadis from other Kharijite was their renunciation of violence against other Muslims. Ibadis are found in the Mzab Valley in Algeria, in Jerba Island in Tunisia, in Foussa Mountains in Libya, in Oman and in Zanzibar and some small pockets along the East African coast and the interior. Those in Mzab and in Jerba and most of those in Fusa Mountains are Berbers ethnically. They've kept close connections with each other, and one of those strong connections has always been the Algerian-Tunisian one. Mzabis have close financial and intellectual connections with Tunisia, and the Mzabi merchants or ulama have always dotted the Tunisian landscape. However, in the early 20th century, a new layer in this Algerian-Tunisian connection was added, with Algerian students this time, including those coming from the Mzab Valley, started to go to Tunisia in groups in order to study at the Zaytuna and Al-Khalduniya. While Algerians had always been heading to Tunisia for education, that was done at the individual level. It was Abdelhamid bin Badis, a graduate of Zaytuna, who encouraged Algerian students to go to Tunisia in groups, in student missions, and attend the Zaytuna. That's after his return from Tunisia in 1912. The first student mission arrived from eastern Algeria in 1913, and other missions returned after the First World War. It's within those missions that we locate Algerian nationalists such as Mubarak al-Mili, Ahmed Tawfiq al-Madani, Muhammad Khairuddin, and Mufti Zakaria. The latter, for example, Mufti Zakaria, the great poet of North Africa and the Algerian Revolution, belongs to those student missions, more specifically the one coming from southern Algeria, from the Ibadi stronghold of the Mzab Valley. And this flow of Ibadi students from Mzab into Tunisian educational institutions should be put into the larger context of Islamic reform. By the late 19th century, we see the Mzab being drawn into the circles of Islamic reform propagated by Al-Afghani and Abdo and their followers, with the focus of this movement on the need for Muslim unity and the need to modernize Islamic societies. The call for Muslim unity found receptive ears among Ibadis, who ultimately developed a discourse that minimized and in some cases nullified differences between Ibadism and other Muslim sects, and more specifically Sunnism. It led to a reconsideration of Ibadi history and of Ibadi identity in order to find common ground with other Muslims. A modern education was perceived by reformers as a mean to empower Muslims, and the Zaytuna and Al-Khalduniya institutes in Tunis were regarded as exemplary in that regard. Since no such institutions existed in Algeria at the turn of the 20th century, Algerians sought this type of education in Tunisia, where they kept going even after some institutes in Algeria became licensed by Zaytuna and Al-Khalduniya. But Algerians in Tunisia gained more than a modern education. It's within the halls of Zaytuna and Al-Khalduniya and within the alleys of Tunis that a generation of Algerians was radicalized by Tunisian politics, as their presence there coincided with the rise of a vibrant press culture and the founding of the Free Constitutional Party, headed by Tha'alibi, who himself was of an Algerian origin and was a friend of many Mzabis who were in Tunis. Mzabis had established the primary Siddiqiyya school that was closed down by the French authorities. Then they started to send students to Tunisia in May 1914 amidst a debate between conservatives and reformers in the Mzab on the merit of such missions and such a modern education. The first mission was headed by Sheikh Ibrahim Abul Yaqdan and Al-Hajj Omar Al-Anq. The students were sponsored by their families, by Mzabi merchants in Tunisia, who donated money to build a residence for the Mzabi students in Tunis known as Dar al-Ba'tha, and to subsidize Mzabi students. Bin Badis, who was invited to attend a performance by the Mzabis on one of his visits to Tunisia, was very impressed by the mission's dedication and organization, and wrote in admiration of the accomplishments of the Mzabi students there, hoping their peers in Algeria would get such privileges too. Those heading the Mzabi student missions were advocates of religious reform and part of this religious reformist network that we call the Islahi or the Salafi network, stretching throughout the Arab world and in which Ibadis, as I said, were assimilated. Both the heads of the missions and the students themselves took advantage of the vibrant Tunisian press at the time and submitted contributions to various newspapers, voicing opposition to French policies in Algeria in particular and criticizing those. In Tunisia, they could express their opinions in ways that were almost impossible in Algeria. One of those was Abu al-Yaqdhan, who published in Al-Munir, Al-Ittihad, Lisan al-Sha'b, and Murshid al-Ummah. All those were Tunisian newspapers. And upon his return to Algeria in the mid-20s, he established 7 newspapers whose role in Algerian intellectual and political history and Algerian nationalist thought is yet to be explored. And his newspapers illustrate very well the origins of Algerian nationalism as espoused by this network, seeking to anchor territorial nationalism in an Arab Islamic milieu. Even the Berber identity was marginalized by those Muslim reformers, the Ibadi ones, and reinterpreted to find harmony with Arabism. It's very striking, by the way. What's striking about this generation of Ibadi reformers is the degree to which they endorsed Arab nationalism. A student at Zaytuna was the then teenager Mufti Zakaria, who would later become the prominent member of the ENA and later the party of the Algerian people, and is known as the poet of North Africa and of the Algerian Revolution, whose contributions to Algerian 20th century history have only been recently allowed to be integrated into the Algerian nationalist narrative. He was officially banned from the Algerian nationalist narrative for some reasons. He was born in the Mzab Valley in 1908 and moved to Annaba with his father, who was a merchant, where he learned Arabic and religious sciences. He joined one of the Mzabi missions to Tunisia in 1922 and lived with his uncle Saleh bin Yahya. Saleh bin Yahya aided the Thalibi in launching the Free Constitutional Party and was a key fundraiser for the party, collecting donations from Mzabi merchants and shop owners who resided in Tunisia. It was at his uncle's place that Mufti was introduced to Thalibi and to the activities of the party, whose meetings and rallies Mufti attended. Also, as a member of the students' mission, he was introduced to the activists and scholars who visited the students very often, such as Ben Badis or Suleiman al-Barouni and others. He published his first poem on May 6, 1925 in Tunisia about Morocco and the Rif uprising there. Again, it was published in several Tunisian newspapers and reprinted in some Egyptian ones as well. And it was at his uncle's house at Dar al-Ba'tha and in the halls of Zaytuna and Al-Khalduniya that this young man, who endured prison and wrote the poetry that fueled resistance to French colonialism, that he witnessed his early radicalization and political and literary activism, and his budding as a revolutionary teenager who also believed in an Algerian nationalism defined by Islam and Arabism and was anchored in the unity of the Maghreb and the Arab world. Okay, I'll skip a small part. Now, the need to resurrect the voices of Algerians in Tunisia serves two purposes. One is to identify the different streams of nationalist thought and decentralize the nationalist the discourse itself, highlighting the role of the diaspora within the Arab world, especially in Tunisia, in shaping a nationalist identity for Algeria in the 20th century and in contributing to anti-colonial activities. This is an attempt to break the monopoly of the French nexus over Algerian history. The other purpose is to look at the role of the diasporic element of Algerians as one that necessitated cooperation with and assimilation within transnational networks that produced hybrid versions of nationalism, accommodating territorial nationalism such as Algerian nationalism with pan-Maghrebism and pan-Arabism. The intellectual productivity of the Algerian diaspora in the Arab world thus offers a new perspective on the development and modes of operation of nationalist ideologies and anti-colonial movements after the First World War. we find that nationalist ideologies among diasporic communities are tied to broader intellectual and political networks and to transnational movements formulating nationalist ideologies in a collective manner. Thank you.